The Demon Slayer world is anything but idyllic. Death lurks around every corner, and there isn't a single character in the show that hasn't experienced some type of loss, be it Tanjiro losing his family, Uraraki losing his students, or the entire Demon Slayer Corps losing Kyojuro Rengoku. While all characters share the experience of losing someone or something they care about, each character reacts to the loss differently, and that, to me, is one of the key aspects of the show that makes it so excellent. Grief is a deeply personal emotion, and in Demon Slayer, every death has immense meaning because everyone internalizes their grief towards the loss differently. In this video, I'll be discussing the diverse expressions of grief in Demon Slayer and how they relate to the commonly accepted 7 stages of grief, using Tanjiro, Shinjiro Rengoku, Uraraki, Zenitsu, Kaguya, and Shinobu as examples. Among these characters, I'll be focusing the most heavily on Tanjiro and how he interacts with the stages of grief as he internalizes the death of his family. Before I get into the analysis itself though, it's first important to go over what the stages of grief are and where the concept came from. The notion that there are stages of grief was originally devised by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in 1969. In her book, On Death and Dying, Kubler-Ross introduced 5 stages of grief: denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. The book itself is a collection of interviews with people who are about to die, and through these interviews she hoped to provide insight to those who had just experienced a loss. Since her publication, the stages of grief have expanded from 5 to 7. The now commonly accepted stages of grief are shock and denial, pain and guilt, anger and bargaining, depression, reflection and loneliness, the upward turn, reconstruction and working through, and acceptance. In Demon Slayer, the viewer can see characters stuck at each stage of grief, and since the viewer is with Tanjiro from the moment his family dies, the viewer also sees Tanjiro working through each stage. I argue that by the middle of the Entertainment District arc, Tanjiro has worked through each stage of grief. Dealing with grief is a central theme of the show from the first episode, and as such, Tanjiro is seen dealing with the first stage of grief, shock and denial, from the onset of the show. The series begins by showing Tanjiro head into town to sell charcoal to support his family. As he is heading home the next day, he realizes something is wrong, and when he returns, he finds that his entire family has been slaughtered, except for his younger sister, Nezuko, who has been turned into a demon. It is here that Tanjiro experiences the first stage of grief, shock and denial. In a few short hours, Tanjiro went from being the eldest brother of a loving family to the sole surviving member of his family. In his shock, Tanjiro is unable to accept that Nezuko has turned into a demon, and he refuses to fight her even as she attacks him. As Nezuko attacks him, Tanjiro tells her not to become a demon even though she has clearly become one. It is here that Tomioka Giyu interferes and tries to kill Nezuko to prevent her from killing Tanjiro. However, Tanjiro still refuses to accept that Nezuko is irredeemable, and when Giyu tells Tanjiro that it is impossible to turn a demon back into a human, Tanjiro claims that he will find a way no matter what. In this scene, Tanjiro is clearly in denial. Overcome by the shock of his entire family being murdered, Tanjiro is unable to accept the fact that Nezuko is no longer human. As Nezuko is attacking him, Tanjiro even says that if he can just save Nezuko, then he can make up for the fact that he was unable to protect his family. The second stage of grief, pain and guilt, is also shown in the first episode, but it appears most clearly when Tanjiro is on his way to Uradaki's house, and later when he is training with Uraraki. In the first episode, Tanjiro cries when he thinks about the fact that his entire family was being murdered while he was sleeping peacefully at Saburo's house. Even though nothing would have likely changed if Tanjiro were home during the attack besides him getting murdered as well, he tells Nezuko that he is sorry he couldn't save her, and the same applies to the rest of his family. In this way, Tanjiro has a clear case of survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt is a type of guilt associated with PTSD, whereby a person feels that they are wrong for surviving a situation when others did not. Nancy Sherman, a PhD holder in psychology, claims that survivor's guilt begins with a loop of, quote, counterfactual thoughts that you could have or should have done otherwise, though in fact you did nothing wrong. Tanjiro is in no way responsible for his family's death, and would not have been able to defend his family against demons at that time anyway, so even if he were home, it would not have made a difference, but he still feels that their death is his responsibility. Tanjiro later gets over his survivor's guilt during Mugen Train, but survivor's guilt, and consequently the second stage of grief, follows him throughout the duration of the first season. In addition to this, guilt and pain is shown when Tanjiro is following Uraraki back to his house. While running through a rice field, Tanjiro guiltily thinks about how Nezuko would always mend her kimono instead of buying a new one, because she would rather spend money on food for her siblings. Tanjiro then swears that when Nezuko turns back into a human, he will buy her a new kimono and much more, claiming that everything he couldn't do for the rest of his family, he will do that and more for Nezuko. In this scene, Tanjiro's guilt is clearly present. He feels guilty that he can no longer do anything for his family, so he vows that he will give everything he can to Nezuko. Tanjiro feels that if he can give everything to Nezuko, it will make up for the fact that he can no longer do anything for his family. When Tanjiro is training with Uraraki, his guilt is most clearly seen when he records everything Nezuko is missing while she sleeps in his journal. While Tanjiro has always been a dutiful brother, he is likely so meticulous about writing because he feels guilty that she is missing out on 2 years of her life. Moving on, the third stage of grief, anger and bargaining, is most clearly shown in episodes 7 and 8, after Tanjiro fights the swamp demon and then encounters Muzan for the first time. While talking to Kazumi, whose fiancé was just eaten by the swamp demon, Tanjiro internalizes just how many people have lost their loved ones because of Muzan. It is at this moment that Tanjiro's anger comes to a boiling point and he vows to never forgive Muzan, no matter what happens. Later in that episode, when Tanjiro catches Muzan's scent, he sprints in Muzan's direction, desperate to find him. When he eventually does, Tanjiro is so overcome with rage that he can't move. Muzan has a human wife and child, which only causes Tanjiro's hatred towards Muzan to grow. Tanjiro is rightfully angry that his family was ripped from him, and this rage surfaces throughout the series whenever Muzan comes up. Tanjiro also displays bargaining in this scene, as he demands Muzan to turn Nezuko back into a human, even though there is no evidence at this time that such a thing is possible. While Tanjiro tries not to dwell too much on stage 4, depression, there are clearly moments in the show where his negative emotions get the better of him. There are times when Tanjiro breaks down and cries, but given his circumstances, he pulls himself together remarkably quickly and hasn't experienced a prolonged depressive episode. Tanjiro's grief fuels his actions, so while he is obviously distraught over his family's death, depression doesn't have a very strong grip on him. In terms of loneliness, there was one incident in episode 7 that showcased the true extent of Tanjiro's loneliness. While comforting Kazumi, who lost his fiancé, Tanjiro tells him that no matter how many people he loses, he must keep going forward. Through his statement, Tanjiro inadvertently expresses how lonely he is from losing his family. Tanjiro then gives Kazumi a lonely smile before continuing onward, and it is here that Kazumi's anger dissipates as he realizes that Tanjiro has suffered a deep loss as well. Next, I would argue that stages 5, the upward turn, and 6, reconstruction and working through, primarily occur during the Mugen Train arc. When fighting Enmu, Tanjiro sees his family tragedy as something that was out of his control for the first time, and it instigates the upward turn in his grief process and allows him to reconstruct and work through what actually happened. During this fight, Enmu transports Tanjiro to a dreamland where his family is still alive. Despite the idyllic conditions he is in though, deep down, Tanjiro knows something is wrong. He questions why Nezuko is able to walk in the sunlight and feels pangs of grief that are unexplainable. Tanjiro's ability to know that something is wrong shows that he has internalized his family's death. Even when faced with an alternative reality of them being alive, Tanjiro has reflected on their death for so long that he knows deep down that they are already gone. This breakthrough is Tanjiro's upward turn, and Tanjiro is able to reconstruct and work through the tragedy when Enmu shows him a dream of his family blaming him for surviving when the rest of them died, or in Nezuko's case, was turned into a demon. It is in this moment that Tanjiro has to confront his survivor's guilt face on, and he clearly has a different perspective on it than he did earlier in the series. At this stage, Tanjiro recognizes that his family loves him and would never be resentful for him surviving over them. It is in this moment that the viewer can see how much Tanjiro has evolved from the first episode of the series. At first, Tanjiro was overwhelmed by guilt and grief that he felt towards his family's death, but in Mugen Train, Tanjiro accepts that his family is full of caring people who would be happy he survived, not jealous. Even when faced with a barrage of images that show his family dying in gruesome ways, Tanjiro is able to recognize that he is lucky to have had such a caring and loving family at all, and that he shouldn't feel bad any longer for living his life. Finally, Tanjiro's 7th stage is most evident in the 5th episode of the Entertainment District arc. When battling Daki, Tanjiro struggled to use Hinokami Kagura more than a few times, and it is during this low point that Tanjiro remembers what he is fighting for. He is fighting so that no one else has to die, like his family or Rengoku. In this moment, it is evident that Tanjiro has finally accepted the death of his family, and instead of focusing on his regret, is now focusing on what he can do in the future. It is here that Tanjiro's motivation switches from survivor's guilt to the desire to protect anyone he can. In the first season of the show, whenever someone asked Tanjiro why he became a member of the Demon Slayer Corps, he answered that it was to find a way to turn Nezuko back into a human. While this is still a clear main motivation for him, the fight against Daki was the first time Tanjiro claimed that he fights to protect rather than just for Nezuko or to revenge his family. In this way, this scene shows how Tanjiro has accepted what has happened in the past, and is now looking forward to who he can protect in the present. Overall, Tanjiro's development throughout the show has been shown in tandem with him moving through each stage of grief, which is part of what made the first 2 seasons so amazing. Grief is a central element of the show, and the way in which the show displayed Tanjiro healing from his family's death marked his development for the first 2 seasons. Tanjiro isn't the only character to experience grief though. Other characters in Demon Slayer are also shown working through stages of grief, though they are typically stuck in one of the stages. To briefly showcase how other characters are stuck in different stages of grief, I will talk about Shinobu, Shinjiro, Uraraki, Zenitsu, and Kaguya's expression of grief within the show. To start, I will delve into Shinobu's grief. Shinobu's grief towards her sister's death mostly takes the form of the 3rd stage of grief, anger and bargaining. When talking with Tanjiro about her sister on the roof, Shinobu tells Tanjiro that she hates all demons and will never get over how her sister died. Even though she knows it's impossible, Shinobu feels that if she kills every demon, it will somehow make up for the fact that her sister died, which also displays the bargaining aspect of this phase. Though Shinobu outwardly radiates a calm energy, Tanjiro can smell the anger permeating within her. Next, Shinjiro Rengoku is stuck in the 4th stage of grief, depression. While his grief takes the form of anger on the outside, I argue that a lot of his actions actually stem from an unchecked, self-destructive depression. It is important to emphasize that depression itself does not necessarily lead to high-risk behaviors, but it can lead some people, again I emphasize definitely not all, down paths of self-injurious behaviors like self-harm or the alcoholism Shinjiro experiences. Spoiler warning for the Stories of the Water and the Flame manga volume, but in this volume, Kyojiro is shown trying to get his father to attend the Flame Pillar Hashira meeting, but he is unable to get his father to move. Shinjiro throws a bottle of sake at Kyojiro, and eventually Kyojiro gives up and attends the Hashira meeting himself. While there, Kyojiro says that his father lost his will to fight after his wife died. The fact that he lost his will to go on highlights that Shinjiro is stuck in the depressive stage of grief. Finally, the 12-moon demon Kyojiro fights to become Hashira holds a grudge against Shinjiro because Shinjiro didn't finish him off, rather he just hacked him to pieces. By not seeing the point in killing demons anymore during this fight, Shinjiro clearly shows that he is stuck in an immobilizing depression. Uraraki is also stuck in the 4th stage, but he most accurately represents reflection and loneliness. After losing so many pupils during the final selection, Uraraki tried his best to prevent Tanjiro from participating in the final selection. Uraraki made Tanjiro's final test slicing a boulder because he thought it would be impossible. When Tanjiro was finally able to slice the boulder in half, Uraraki was shocked and solemn because he thought that this meant he would lose yet another one of his precious students. Moving on, the character that most clearly represents the 6th stage of grief, reconstruction and working through, is Zenitsu. After Rengoku's death, Zenitsu starts training without complaining for pretty much the first time ever. During his initial training with Gramps, Zenitsu continuously tried to run and believed that he would not be able to succeed, so he shouldn't try. Even after the fight against the spider demons, Zenitsu was slow to start improving himself, though it was clear that he needed to. However, after Rengoku's death, Zenitsu immediately throws himself into training. This shows that Zenitsu's grief style most closely reflects reconstruction and working through, because after someone he knows dies, he immediately reflects on how he needs to get stronger and throws himself into training. Zenitsu's development after Rengoku's death culminates in the first episode of the Entertainment District arc, when he takes position against Tengen when he tries to kidnap Aoi for a mission. Before, Zenitsu would have been a lot more hesitant to stand up to someone as strong as a Hashira, but after seeing what weakness can do during Mugen Train, Zenitsu tries his best to face his fears and stand up for what he has to. Finally, the master of the Demon Slayers, Kaguya Ubeyashiki, most clearly represents the final stage of grief, acceptance. As Kaguya walks to the Demon Slayer graveyard, he lists the name of each fallen slayer. While he clearly mourns each of their deaths, he has also accepted their deaths as contributions to the Demon Slayer mission, even though it doesn't lessen the pain of the loss. He believes that the Demon Slayer Corps must continue to fight demons to uphold the legacy of those who have passed away. Overall, by showing how characters interact with the 7 stages of grief, I hoped to showcase how the plot of Demon Slayer is driven by the repercussions death has on those left behind. Demon Slayer is such an excellent show because it exemplifies how the process of mourning is not a monolith. People deal with loss in different ways, and it can take a while to properly work through feelings of immense grief. Since the viewer is with Tanjiro from the moment his family dies, we are able to see what it takes to work through the death of a loved one, and that is part of what makes the show so impactful. So that's it for this video. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Sorry I haven't posted in almost a year. I got my first adult job, and it has been taking up so much of my time. I'm hoping to start posting more, so I will see you in my next video.